Pleased you could join us today. My name is Joanna Bourke and I'm the principal investigator for the SHAME team. SHAME standing for Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters. And today we have the great treat of having Lord Blair come to speak to us. Welcome, Lord Blair.
Joanna, thank you.
Straight into it. I mean, obviously, we want to talk to you about the work you did in the 1980s. Ours has a big historical component to it. But before we go into that kind of side to your career, can you tell us something about your career more broadly?
Yes, I joined the Metropolitan Police in 1974 under the then graduate entry scheme, because there'd been an inquiry into the police in the late 60s. Which discovered there were very, very few graduates in the organisation, and policing, as ever, was becoming more complex. So they introduced a system of graduate entry, and I joined. I got onto that scheme and joined. I think it was a very surprising decision for me to become a police officer, particularly surprising to my parents, I think. There was still a slight stigma of the working class about policing as a profession. I think that's largely disappeared. They had scrimped and saved and sent me to a minor public school and then to Oxford. And they didn't really expect me to come back and say, I want to be a police officer. I think it's to do with the fact that I had a slightly lonely childhood with rather elderly parents, and there must have been some public sector ethos around, whether it's reading too many books by Henley or whatever it was, or but my brother went into public service and I went into public service, so there's something there. I went to West End Central, which is the police station just off Oxford Street. Good place to start. And under the scheme, I was promoted as sergeant after 3 years, although I'd done a bit of time as a detective as well. And then in the fourth year, I went to the Police Staff College, and we'll start the story there. But for the rest of my career, I worked mainly as a CID officer, and then eventually became the Chief Staff Officer to Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary at the Home Office, which gave me a helicopter view of the service. And then I joined Thames Valley Police as an assistant, and then Deputy Chief Constable, and then back to the Met as the Deputy Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner in 2000, became Commissioner in 2005, at the very end of 2008.
Great. I mean, one of the reasons I'm particularly interested in your work is because I'm an historian, and I remember when I was starting this project, I picked up your book, which was published in 1985, called Investigating Rape: A New Approach for Police. There it is. I mean, and for the 1980s, this was a real landmark book from a policeman actually writing about an issue that, let's be blunt about it, had been largely ignored and was not being treated well. How did you come to write that book?
Well, it is actually a story of extraordinary coincidences, and at one point, staggering bravery, I think, by me. I mean, how I had the confidence to do something that I did, I look back and I really wonder. Could have been a rapid end to my career, I think. So I went to the Staff College in 1978 on what was called a special course, and it lasted a year and was designed to produce the Chief Constables of the future 20 years on. I mean, that's exactly what it is. It's and it still goes on in some shape, but not quite the same. As part of that, you have to do a thesis. And I decided to do a thesis on whether the current law, which still exists, prohibiting police officers being members of trade unions, was a good idea or not. Well, I put a survey out. There must have been 200 officers at the Staff College on different courses. So I put a survey around asking lots of questions. And suddenly I was summoned to the delightfully named commandant of the college and told in no uncertain terms that I was not to do this research. I kept research for years. It was really very interesting because a lot of the northern forces were not conservative. The officers were not conservative stuff. They were all style labour, and it was which would have been quite an interesting piece of work. So I decided that I'd have a look through the library, and I found quite a lot of American books on rape investigation. And I'd done some rape investigations at Notting Hill before I'd come to the. No, that's wrong. No, I had seen some rape investigations underway before I came to the college. And I decided to. This would be interesting. I just did basically studied American literature, so almost a review rather than. So that was that. Then when I did go as a detective sergeant the next year, 1979, I did investigate some rapes. And I did notice that what the Americans were saying was absolutely true. That if the victim was treated as if the account she was giving was true, you've got a much clearer statement than if people bombarded her with questions trying to make her not have, her story wasn't being believed. Then she got confused, and then as she got more confused, a kind of vicious circle sets in, because if you're giving different accounts, the officers don't believe you. So that's where that goes. And then in 1982, I think, there was a fly on the wall documentary about, it was the very first one, about Thames Valley Police. I think there were 12 episodes, and one of them followed the course of a rape investigation in which the officers were described by their own chief constable as showing inept and unprofessional behaviour, clearly had some form of psychiatric disturbance, and got her to withdraw the allegation. Then I found there was a thing called the Police Bursaries Trust, run by the Home Office, which would send an officer abroad to study a particular subject. And I applied for it. I was a detective inspector at the time. And much to my surprise, I decided that I applied to go and study rape investigation in America, which I'm going to New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York. And I found a very interesting time. I did discover, particularly interesting in San Francisco, a fully trained sex crimes with psychiatrists explaining rape trauma syndrome to the officers. I sat on interviews and I saw exactly what they were doing. They were absolutely supporting the woman, not inviting her to embellish the truth or anything like that, but actually treating the person in a way that would make the truth be more likely to come out. And I thought that's fantastic. When I got back, I had to write a report, and then I had a report dropped into somewhere. The next thing that happened was that an organisation called the Police Foundation then came into me and asked me to write the book. And as I started to write the book, one very specific detail came out. The people who were best trained in sexual offence investigation, which was the San Francisco police in particular, had the lowest detection rate of all the forces that I looked at, and many more. What I did was I got the statistics for a lot of big city police forces in America. And of course, the reason what then came out was that these forces, and I'd seen this in San Francisco, classified the results of the investigation as the suspect has been charged, that's a detected offence, no crime has been committed, and then not detected. Really, three. I mean, occasionally other ones were reclassified as another offence or something like that. But they had very high levels of not detected. And I thought, well, interesting. And then I was posted to we had a new commissioner come in, Sir Kenneth Newman, who was a great fan of policing by objectives, that Herman Goldstein's work, trying to put management theory into policing, and Newman set up 4 new units, each of the 4 areas of the Met, it's cut into 4, to try to raise performance by getting people to report what the performance was. And most people were terribly irritated with us, because this just felt like, I'm here from headquarters and I'm here to help you, not necessarily good. And we asked them endless questions, as dictated by our masters, as to how are you doing on this sort of crime, how are you doing on that sort of crime, what's your sickness levels, all those sorts of things. And so I eventually slipped a questionnaire in of my own. That's the bit of bravery, if not effrontery. I mean, I don't, overconfident. And I asked a quarter of the Met to look at their offences that were classified as an allegation of rape for 3 months, some 6 months before, so they'd all be cleared up by now, or whatever. The investigation would be unlikely to be going on. And what I got back was very interesting. The Met at that stage claimed a 56% clear-up rate for rape. So 56% of offences that were reported to the police ended in at least a trial. Conviction or otherwise is not the case. In actual fact, in that quarter of the Met, it was 12%. Because there were so many cases were regarded as not a crime, or witness withdrew allegation. If I may, I'll just try and explain why I think that happened. And it wasn't sheer misogyny. It was the sense that juries were still looking for a certain kind of rape, in the sense of ones they'd be prepared to convict. I mean, if the woman, just putting it bluntly, is the virgin returning from church who's attacked in a dark alley by a knife-wielding person, that case is going straight to the jury. The officers, I think, had come to a kind of compact with almost the legal profession, that it just wasn't worth putting people through the ordeal of a case that was almost bound to fail. I mean, that's putting the most charitable argument on it, but I do think there was a significant factor that it was that. Now, we didn't have at that stage what we now have as the Crown Prosecution Service. So we had a Metropolitan Police Solicitors Department who dealt with, as every other police force had their own. And they would also have taken the same view, I think. So there was a sort of legitimizing of why it wasn't right. But clearly, if 1 or 2 newspapers got hold of the 12% versus 56%, that is a humdinger of a story. And so I got a bomb in my hands. And so I decided to trail off to Scotland Yard, where I've hardly ever been, to see the most senior woman detective in the force, who was a really wonderful lady called Thelma Wagstaff. And she had become a detective commander, and no woman had ever been there. Commander is the equivalent of an assistant chief constable. It's a senior rank, and she worked alongside the assistant commissioner of crime, somebody who's so close to God, in my eyes, that I've never met anybody of that rank. So anyway, I make an appointment to see her, and she said, why? And I said, because I've got some information that I think you need to know about. She must have thought, who is this and what's he coming for? Anyway, I handed over this very compact little graph and so on, and just said, you better have a look at this. She was absolutely stunned. And I think she asked me to go away and come back tomorrow. And I came back tomorrow, and she said, I've made an appointment with the Assistant Commissioner of Crime. I'm going to go in first, and if he wants to see you, you'll have to remain here until he does want to. He may not want to see you. She came back with a grin about a foot wide on her face, saying he's absolutely furious. And when I suggested that he might want to see you, he absolutely said, I never want to speak to him, or something. Anyway, she said he'd ordered that the research be repeated for the same dates in the other 3 quarters of the Met. And I got a call from Thelma Wagstaff about 4 weeks later saying it's worse in other places, so it's even lower. And we've got to do something about it. And at that point, everything started to change. I don't think I still ever met the Assistant Commissioner of Crime. But what we did was we set up, within about a year, we set up a special training course at the Met Detective Training Centre, which had eventually evolved into sexual offences investigative technique trained officers all over the Met, and training for the detective inspectors who would supervise them. And my favourite story is the very first course, which I took, and 2 days. And they came up with, I think, 2 women officers and a DI who was almost always male, but not always. And one of the men there sat there in complete frustrated silence, never getting involved. And about halfway through the second day, I said to him, how are you viewing this? And he said, I'm absolutely furious. I've done 28 years in this job. Why did nobody tell me this before? I've got to kiss him. It was an absolute breakthrough, and so then we went on, and then the training went national. And that's the story. That's why it got better.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting story. I mean, you talk about the no criming problem that was there. But there's also, of course, the rape trauma syndrome aspect of your book and your which was very influential in getting the police aware that women respond in very different ways to being assaulted. Why do you think that some jurisdictions in America were doing much better or more aware of this than others? And why was it so late to come to Britain?
I wouldn't. I mean, I think they were 10 years ahead. I mean, sooner or later, this was going to come. Looking at the material that I read at Bramshill House, most of the books were probably written at a decade before, so they were trained and they were ahead. It was as simple as that. I don't know what the exact history was of the kind of breakthrough. I mean, one of the things that happened is one of the early things that happened in the States was rape crisis centers. But for some reason in San Francisco, the rape crisis center and the police service weren't at loggerheads. Whereas for years, particularly in London, I remember, the rape crisis center would not acknowledge that the Met was trying to change and would not cooperate. So that it really was quite difficult. I mean, I don't want it to be the case that this one, book and one moment of madness by saying, please give me the answers to these questions, changed the world, because many other things came in. I mean, there was far more care taken over forensics. DNA broke through into the world. We teamed up much later, teamed up with major hospitals in London, so the examinations were taken out of police stations. We built rape units, where rape studios, or I think they were called, where, although there were still police doctors, or police employed doctors, it was a comfortable environment for the interviews and so on. So all those things, once the ball began to roll, it started to roll hard. And there were a number of very significant women who, in the service, who said, this is fantastic, let's go with it, and took their own risks.
I mean, between 2005 and 2008, you were Commissioner of Police of the Metropolis. And of course, a lot happened in that period, which I don't want to minimize. But in terms of sexual violence, what does that period represent to you? What were the challenges that that you faced then, and your force faced then?
Well, I mean, you do have to accept that it was not at the forefront of what was happening, because in the years that passed, obviously, race became an enormously significant matter for the Met to come to terms with the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and so on. And of course, we had the bombs in 2005, which was the greatest act of murder in recent British history. What was already happening in the Met was that there were every division of the Met had its own sexual offences team, and I think there were a number of moves whether the teams remained separate about adult sexual abuse and children's work, which became the children's stuff arrived again. It was, another disaster of death of baby P in that period. So that became quite a conscious thing to do. I think the only bit I really remember is that whoever was in charge of the sex crime policy area knew of my book and had been on the courses, and she asked me to come and address the group of they had an annual conference, I think, of SOIT trained people, SOIT being sexual offences investigative trained, and it was like a revivalist meeting because I told them the story. I mean, some of them were probably still in kindergarten when I was doing this, so that I do remember. But I don't. I think I think the difficult bit is not anything about me at all. It's what's happened since. I think, as you know, the way in which rape is now a matter of grave criminological concern is because so few cases are going to court, and I don't know what the answer is, because it is everything to do, as you and anybody else involved in this world of work knows, is it's about really the invention of mobile phones, smartphones, because in the past I didn't have to investigate much about the previous relationship between the accused and the alleged victim. Well, obviously, if it was obvious that they were in a relationship or had been in a relationship, and she hadn't told me, and he stood up in court and said, "Well, I was a girlfriend for, a boyfriend for 5 years." I mean, that would be a material fact, and I would have had a very poor investigation on my hands if I hadn't known that. But the idea that the police are now under an obligation to find any connection between the victim and the suspect by trawling through hours of text messages, half in code. I mean, I think this is a dreadful place we've got ourselves into. So I suppose, and the other thing that I see that the CPS has done is started to issue guidance about sexting, and that sexting is not necessarily a sign of consent. We go back to rape is a very serious charge, life imprisonment at its maximum. And what does a jury do about people who send intimate pictures to themselves, and when one of them says, "No, I didn't want to have sex with him"? And that's a challenge for our times.
Look, thank you so much, Lord Blair. I'm really, really interested in hearing your views, and I hope that we can have a proper conversation about this on another occasion. Thank you so much.
That would be great. Okay, thank you, Joanna. All the best, and the best wishes for the festive season in this very strange world.
Thank you, and to you too.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.